right, so strengthening questions. I gave you all some question stems as well, just to ID them. But basically, you've got strengthen, which one of the following most strongly supports, which one of the following most justifies or most helps to justify, same thing, or provides additional support. And you're looking to make the conclusion more likely to be valid given the evidence. So anything that makes the conclusion more likely given that evidence will, of course, strengthen the argument. So you want to support the argument by helping to bridge the gap between the evidence and conclusion. You're not necessarily bridging the gap all the way. That's a job for sufficient assumption questions. Let me be clear about that. But it does help. And I'll draw some distinctions between strengthen and other question types as well. Whatever I say about strengthen, the opposite would be true of weaken. So weaken makes the argument conclusion less likely to be valid, and you are exposing or widening the gap between the evidence and conclusion in that type. So some people will prefer strengthen, some prefer weaken. Our focus, of course, tonight is strengthen, but if you like weaken better and you don't like strengthen, just think about doing the opposite. Whenever the opposite of weaken is, would be then strengthening it. Obviously, we'll get into examples as well. So for strengthening questions, you may have a given possibility or given explanation. I'm thinking here a lot about causal reasoning. We talked in the past about causal versus conditional. Causal reasoning, if there is a proposed or supposed cause for a given effect, if you downplay alternatives, you are then, of course, promoting the stated explanation or possibility for a given conclusion or given effect. You also may want to promote the evidence's relevance to the conclusion. So, of course, the evidence is given, it's not open to question. But if you say the evidence actually matters relative to the conclusion, that, of course, helps the argument because you're tightening that connection between them. You may also be looking to support the evidence's validity. And I get questions about this sometimes, what I mean by this, because, of course, the evidence is given, how could it not be valid? So what I say about that is if the evidence is a study or a survey, giving us reason to believe that that study or survey was properly conducted would help to strengthen the argument because you're boosting up the evidence, the usefulness of the evidence. If the survey or study was not properly conducted, well, then it may not really play as much of a role to help that conclusion because the survey or study itself would be open to question. So that's what I mean there. And then even providing additional evidence in any way could help to support the conclusion and help to strengthen things overall. And you really are looking to strengthen the argument, meaning as I said, the relationship or the relevance of evidence to conclusion. That is important. But if you're downplaying alternatives, then you are actually strengthening the argument, even if you don't directly touch upon the evidence. Now, I want you to remember that strengthening questions, just like weakened questions, they're opening the door to new information. Doesn't matter how extreme it is, as long as it gets the job done. So people will say, well, that strengthener or proposed strengthener isn't really that likely. Doesn't matter. They said, if that happened, if that is true, what's the effect? What's the consequence? So when they say that phrase, if true, in the question stem, they're opening that door to new information. So any question type that opens the door to new information, saying if true, take the choice as given and ask yourself, well, simply what is the consequence? That's true of strengthen, that's true of weaken. It's also true of sufficient assumption, by the way. But other question types like inference category do not open the door to new information. Really important distinction there. Inference family questions, you're taking the stimulus as given and simply asking what must be true or what is likely to be true on the basis of the information above. Strengthen, weaken, sufficient assumption, very different. They're saying which one of the choices, if true or if assumed, would then boost up the stimulus. Very different perspectives there. Now, it's important to keep the proper distinctions between different question types. Strengthen versus sufficient assumption are very different things. Strengthening questions are opening the door to new information, just like sufficient assumption questions. But an important distinction is strengthen has to simply help the argument, whereas sufficient assumption will guarantee the argument 100% leaving no ambiguity at all. That's a difference of degree, but also in practice, there's a difference in terms of approach. We've gone over in the past the sufficient assumption formulas, and they involve formal logic. As we saw, you can often diagram them. And while you don't necessarily need to diagram them all the time, it can be useful to do so and at least be able to do so. Strengthening questions, though, are informal logic, which in a way is why I like them a lot, because there's that real world engagement, like you were having a conversation with somebody where you're thinking about what are those alternative possibilities, alternative explanations, and knocking them down in favor of the stated one. And again, simply has to help the argument a little bit, doesn't have to do it all the way. Sufficient assumptions, you need to do it all the way, if not more than all the way. Sufficient assumption, doing it more than all the way is totally fine. And you're much more likely to see that in sufficient assumption than you are in strengthen. So even if it helps it a little bit, that's enough. On the flip side, for weakened questions, you don't have to destroy the argument. You simply have to harm or hurt the argument even just a bit. That would be enough. And for strengthening questions, you won't typically see the term assumes or assumed. It's sufficient assumption questions, you will. So it's probably not that difficult to tell the difference between them, but it's also important to think about how the actual approaches differ. One area students often get confused is with strengthened versus most strongly supported questions, because they both can use the word support or supports or supported. But the difference is, again, that perspective. Strengthened questions are asking which one of the following if true. Most strongly supported would say, if all of the above are true, then what else is incredibly likely? So strengthened opens the door to new information. Most strongly supported, we're not bringing in any new info. We're simply asking what's incredibly likely to be the case based on the information in the stimulus. And one distinction worth drawing is extreme versus moderate. Strengthened questions open the door to new information, which could be extreme. Most strongly supported questions, you want to tend towards more moderate information. More moderate is much more likely to be correct than extreme is. And while most strongly supported, you get a little bit of wiggle room where there could be a little bit of a jump. It's what I would say is a reasonable assumption that's already pretty likely to be true based on the information in the stimulus. So you could go a little bit beyond what's given in the stimulus, but not very much. Strengthening questions, you are looking for new information. Make no mistake about that. You're looking for new information in the choices that will help the argument. By the way, folks, feel free to jump in with questions at any point. I'm happy to work them in here. And of course, we'll get into specific questions as well. So I've got an example here, and I'll show the flip side of that in a second with strengthen. So if we have an argument saying we should eat at that restaurant, after all, it has 5 stars on Yelp, what might strengthen the argument? So our given evidence is about Yelp ratings, Yelp average, Yelp stars. Promoting the validity of those Yelp ratings, the reviews, saying that they are well vetted, they're reliable, they're useful. That would help. That would help. There are lots of ways you could strengthen the argument. That's simply one of them. Anybody want to share another idea how you might strengthen an argument like that? Feel free to unmute yourself or simply type in the chat. Yeah, cool. So somebody said the highest rating on Yelp is 5 stars. Yeah, that would help. I mean, I kind of took it as given, but yeah, that's an open question, actually. What if you have a rating system with 6 stars or 10 stars? After all, you have 6-star hotels, right? So if 5 stars was actually relatively low and it was out of 10, that wouldn't be that meaningful. You could go above that. So if we said 5 was the highest, well, that matters. Yeah, nice. Well done. So that gives some additional context there. It is all relative after all. Then on the flip side for a moment, if we say weaken, if we said, well, Yelp reviews aren't that reliable, we're attacking the reliability or validity of the evidence. We're not saying the Yelp rating isn't 5 stars, but we're saying that maybe that those 5-star ratings aren't really that useful. So that's good to keep in mind. And then you see it really is kind of the flip side there. There are lots of ways to do it, but those are just a couple of examples. And I guess I want to bring up the point that you could take the same argument and make it into a wide variety of question types. I've talked about strengthen and weaken here, but there's also evaluate the argument. So it would help to know how reliable Yelp ratings are. Not necessarily saying they are or they aren't, but for an evaluate the argument question, you're simply saying on the fence between strengthen and weaken, what sort of information would be useful to help us better determine the validity of this argument, the reliability of this argument. And the question is, well, since the evidence is the 5-star rating, knowing a little bit about how useful that rating is or how reliable that rating is would help us to judge whether we should eat at that restaurant given that kind of evidence. Thanks for tuning into the show. Please subscribe if you haven't done so already to be notified of new episodes as I release them. And feel free to reach out if you need anything at all as you move forward with your prep. I'm happy to help however I can. In the meantime, I'll wish you all the best and take care.